The snow fell without sound, each flake a whisper against the darkness. Mason Sullivan's breath clouded before him as he dug the rhythm of steel against frozen earth, the only heartbeat in the wilderness. Moonlight caught the edge of his shovel, turning it silver, then black silver, then black. He'd chosen this spot carefully beneath a pine whose branches hung low with the weight of winter hidden from the trail sacred in its solitude. It wasn't a large grave. It didn't need to be. The wind shifted, carrying with it the distant crack of a rifle. Mason froze shovel mid-strike. His pupils dilated as the Wyoming night melted away, replaced by the smoke-choked fields of Gettysburg. For 3 terrible seconds, he was there again, the screams of men, the copper smell of blood, the weight of his rifle as he sighted down its barrel. No, he whispered the word, disappearing into the night. Not now. He blinked hard, forcing himself back to the present. July 1863 was a decade gone. This was 1873. This was Wyoming territory. This was his penance. Mason set the shovel aside and knelt in the snow. His Union coat, once blue, now faded to the color of storm clouds, hung loose on his frame. From inside, he withdrew a small wooden doll, no larger than his palm. Carved by his own hands, its features were simple: 2 dots for eyes, a line for a mouth, arms pulled tight against its body as if cold or afraid. Robert Whitaker, he said softly, placing the doll in the shallow grave. May God have mercy on your soul and mine. He covered the doll with earth, then snow, until no trace remained. Only Mason would know this spot marked by nothing but memory. He stood, brushed the dirt from his knees, and looked up at the vast Wyoming sky, stars scattered across black velvet, indifferent to the rituals of men below. 17 wooden dolls, 17 souls, 16 now buried, one still carried, one still waiting. The walk back to his cabin took nearly an hour. By the time the structure came into view, moonlight had surrendered to the deep blue of approaching dawn. Mason's cabin stood against the landscape like something both born from it and alien to it. Walls of rough-hewn logs, a pitched roof now heavy with snow, a stone chimney from which smoke curled upward. The only sign of life for miles. Inside, the fire still burned low in the hearth, just as he'd left it. Mason had never let it die out, not once in 10 years. Not during blizzards, not during hunting trips, not during the long nights when sleep refused him. The fire was the one constant, the one living thing he permitted himself to care for. He removed his coat and hung it on a peg by the door. The cabin was sparse but orderly, a wooden table with 1 chair, shelves lined with provisions, a narrow cot in the corner, a trunk at its foot. On the mantel sat a Bible, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. Beside it, a single photograph in a simple frame, a young woman with dark hair and eyes that seemed to follow him across the room. Mason stoked the fire, added another log, and watched as sparks spiraled up the chimney. He wouldn't sleep tonight. He never did after burying one of his dolls. At first light, he saddled his horse, an aging bay mare who'd been with him since the war, and rode the 5 miles into Redemption Creek. It wasn't much of a town: a church, a general store, a saloon, a doctor's office, and a handful of houses strung along what passed for a main street. Most days Mason avoided it. Today he had business. Dr. Thomas Garrett was already awake when Mason knocked, as if he'd been expecting him. A tall man with a white beard and hands spotted with age, the doctor had the steady gaze of someone who'd seen too much suffering to be shocked by anything new. "It's that time of year again," Garrett said, stepping aside to let Mason in. It wasn't a question. Mason removed his hat. Yes. The doctor's office smelled of antiseptic and coffee. Garrett gestured toward a chair, then poured 2 cups from a pot on the stove. Mason took his black wrapping cold fingers around the warm mug. "Who was it this time?" Garrett asked quietly. "Whitaker," Mason replied. "The younger one." Garrett nodded slowly. He was the only person in Redemption Creek who knew about Mason's annual ritual. The only one who knew why a decorated Union officer had chosen to live like a hermit in the Wyoming wilderness. The only one who had seen the list of names Mason kept folded in his Bible, 17 men who died by his hand at Gettysburg, not in the heat of battle, but in a moment that haunted him still. That leaves one, Garrett said. Mason's jaw tightened. Yes. And then one, and then I don't know. Mason stared into his coffee. Maybe the dreams will stop. Garrett sighed to sound heavy with doubt. The war's been over for 8 years, Mason. You can't keep punishing yourself. Can I? The doctor didn't answer. He'd had this conversation with Mason every year for the past decade, and it always ended the same way. Instead, he refilled Mason's cup and changed the subject. Town's growing. Railroad might come through next year. Mason nodded, not particularly interested. The world's progress meant little to him. He finished his coffee, thanked the doctor, and left with supplies that would last him another month of solitude. The ride back to his cabin took longer than the journey in. Snow had started falling again, thick flakes that clung to his eyelashes and melted against his neck. The mare trudged steadily forward, head bowed against the wind. Mason kept his thoughts empty, focusing only on the rhythm of hooves against packed snow. He was halfway home when he heard it, a sound so faint he thought he'd imagined it at first, a soft hitching noise carried on the wind. Mason reined in his horse, turned his head, and listened. There it was again. Not wind, not an animal. A baby crying. Mason dismounted, tied the mare to a bare tree trunk, and moved forward through a stand of pine. The snow muffled his footsteps as he followed the sound, now joined by a second tiny voice, 2 infants crying weakly in the cold. He crested a small rise and stopped abruptly. Before him stood the remains of an old homestead, a house half collapsed, smoke still faint from its chimney, and tied to a post in the yard to a woman. Her head hung forward, dark hair obscuring most of her face. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, exposing skin gone blue with cold. Dried blood crusted her temple. At her feet, wrapped in what looked like an old horse blanket, lay 2 infants, pink-cheeked, despite the cold, fussing weakly. Mason approached slowly, one hand on the knife at his belt. The woman didn't move, didn't acknowledge his presence. For a terrible moment, he thought she was dead, left to freeze with her children. Then her chest rose with a shallow breath. He knelt beside her. Ma'am. Her eyes fluttered open, deep brown and focused with pain and cold. She looked at him without fear, without hope, the gaze of someone who'd already accepted death. Don't take them, she whispered, the words barely audible. Mason's knife made quick work of the ropes binding her wrists. As the final strand broke, she collapsed forward. He caught her surprised by how little she weighed. She was all bones and silence, like something that had been hollowed out from within. They said I wasn't worth feeding, she murmured against his chest. Said girls bring no dowry, that I should have died giving birth. Mason looked down at the infants, now quiet, watching him with dark eyes. Twin girls no older than a few days. One sucked at the corner of the blanket, the other's tiny fist clenched and unclenched in the cold air. He gathered the twins first, tucking them carefully inside his coat, close to his heart. Then he lifted the woman, one arm beneath her knees, the other supporting her back. She was unconscious now, her head lolling against his shoulder. As he turned to carry her to his horse, her face caught the pale winter light. Mason stopped mid-stride, his breath catching in his throat. Those eyes. Though closed now, he'd seen them moments before. Deep brown with a distinctive shape, slightly upturned at the corners. Eyes he knew, eyes he saw every day in the photograph on his mantle. Eyes like Margaret Whitaker's. It wasn't possible. Margaret had died in '65, just after the war ended. He'd heard it from Garrett himself. And yet, the woman stirred in his arms, a small sound of pain escaping her lips. Questions could wait. She and the infants needed warmth, needed care. Mason carried them to his horse, secured them as best he could, and began the slow walk home through deepening snow. You're coming with me, he said, not loudly, just steady like a promise. She didn't answer. By the time they reached the cabin, Twilight had settled over the landscape. Mason kicked the door open with his boot and carried the woman inside. The warmth hit like a physical thing wrapping around them after hours in the cold. He laid her on his cot, then quickly built up the fire. The twins whimpered softly as he unwrapped them from his coat and placed them on a folded blanket near the hearth. Both were soaked through their tiny bodies trembling. Working with quiet efficiency, Mason heated water, found clean cloths, and began the process of caring for three strangers who'd suddenly become his responsibility. He bathed the infants, first their skin so delicate he feared his rough hands might damage it. They cried at first, then settled as the warmth eased their discomfort. The woman was more difficult. Her dress was frozen in places, stuck to her skin. Mason cut it away carefully, keeping his eyes averted as much as possible. Beneath the fabric, her body told a story of suffering, bruises, and various stages of healing. Rope burns on her ankles, as well as her wrists, ribs, visible beneath pale skin. One eye was beginning to swell, the cheekbone possibly fractured. He cleaned her wounds, wrapped her in his spare shirt and a quilt, then turned his attention back to the twins. Finding the last of his goat's milk, he warmed it and fed them using strips of clean cloth they could suck on. They drank greedily, tiny throats, working eyes fluttering closed with each swallow. Only when all three were stable did Mason allow himself to sit back and consider what he'd done. He'd brought strangers into his sanctuary. After 10 years of solitude, of speaking to no one but Garrett and occasionally the shopkeeper in town, his cabin now held a woman and two infants. A woman with Margaret Whitaker's eyes. Mason moved to the mantel and took down the photograph. In it, Margaret stood beside her brother Robert, both of them smiling, unaware of the war that would soon tear their family apart. Margaret, who'd written to Mason after learning he'd killed her brother. Margaret, whose forgiveness he'd never had the chance to ask for. Could this woman be related to her? A cousin, perhaps? The resemblance was striking, but Mason had learned long ago that grief and guilt could play tricks on a man's mind. He replaced the photograph and checked on his patients. The woman's breathing had steadied, but fever flushed her cheeks. The twins slept peacefully, tiny hands occasionally twitching in dreams Mason hoped were kinder than his own. He didn't sleep that night, keeping vigil instead from a chair pulled close to the fire. Every hour he checked the woman's fever-spooned water between her cracked lips, adjusted the blankets around the twins. By dawn, exhaustion had settled into his bones, but he didn't regret his decision. Whatever connection this woman might have to his past, she and her children deserved to live. She woke briefly as morning light filtered through the cabin's single window. Her eyes opened, disoriented and afraid, until they settled on the makeshift cradle where her daughters lay. "You didn't leave us," she whispered, voice raw. Mason shook his head. She tried to rise, then winced as pain overtook her. "My babies? They're safe," Mason said, the words feeling strange in his mouth after so many days of silence. "They're strong." Relief washed over her face, followed by confusion, as she took in her surroundings, the cabin, the fire, Mason himself sitting nearby like some rough guardian. "Who are you?" she asked. "Mason Sullivan." He offered nothing more. "Hannah," she replied. "Hannah Whitaker." The name hit Mason like a physical blow. Whitaker. It couldn't be coincidence. But he kept his expression neutral, merely nodding in acknowledgement. "My daughters," Hannah continued, "they don't have names yet. I wasn't sure they'd—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Mason stood and moved to the fire where he'd been heating broth. He poured some into a tin cup and brought it to her. "They need names now," he said quietly. "They're going to live." Hannah took the cup in trembling hands, wincing as the movement pulled at her injuries. "How can you be so sure?" Mason looked toward the cradle where one of the twins had begun to stir. "Because they're fighters, like their mother." Hannah didn't cry, but something in her expression crumbled, as if kindness was harder to bear than cruelty. She sipped the broth slowly, eyes never leaving her children. "They tied me up yesterday morning," she said after a while, voice detached, as if speaking of someone else. "After Michael, my husband, was buried. His family said twin girls were a curse, that I'd brought shame on their name." Her fingers tightened around the cup. They said the cold would take care of their problem. Anger flickered in Mason's chest, an emotion he hadn't permitted himself to feel in years. Your husband's family did this. Hannah nodded. The Whitakers don't suffer burdens, and women who birth only daughters are burdens of the worst kind. Bitterness edged her voice, especially when those daughters arrive after their father is dead. Mason frowned. Your husband died 3 weeks ago, pneumonia. Hannah's eyes dulled with memory. The twins came early. The midwife said it was the shock of losing him. Mason absorbed this information, turning it over in his mind. If Hannah's husband was a Whitaker and recently deceased, he wasn't on Mason's list. Those Whitakers, Robert and his brother Ezra, would be older now. Perhaps Hannah had married into a different branch of the family. Or perhaps the resemblance to Margaret was merely coincidence after all. Hannah drifted back to sleep shortly after the broth barely touched. Mason took the cup from her hands, then checked on the twins. Both were awake now, dark eyes blinking up at the unfamiliar ceiling. One of them, the slightly smaller of the two, had worked a hand free from the blanket and was waving it in the air. Without thinking, Mason offered his finger. Tiny fingers wrapped around it with surprising strength. You need names, he said softly to the infant. Your mama's right about that. The twins didn't answer, of course, but the one holding his finger seemed to study his face with an intensity that belied her age. Mason felt something shift inside him, like a piston, ice breaking up on a river after a long freeze. He'd saved 3 lives today. It didn't balance his ledger 17 taken against 3 saved, but perhaps it was a start. The next few days settled into an unexpected rhythm. Hannah's fever came and went, spiking dangerously the second night. During her delirium, she called out for people Mason didn't know. Michael, her dead husband, Sarah, a sister perhaps, and most disturbingly, Robert. Robert, please, she'd begged during the worst of it, thrashing against the blankets Mason continually replaced as a sweat soaked through them. Don't let them take my babies. Mason bathed her forehead with cool cloths, murmuring reassurances he wasn't sure she could hear. The name Robert echoed in his mind. Robert Whitaker, the man he'd killed at Gettysburg, the man whose wooden doll he'd buried just days ago. It had to be a different Robert. The timing made no sense otherwise. When Hannah was lucid, Mason asked no questions. He brought her food, helped her sit up to eat, carried her daughters to her so she could hold them. They spoke little. Mason had forgotten the rhythm of conversation, and Hannah seemed grateful for the silence. On the 4th day, Dr. Garrett arrived. Mason had ridden into town the previous afternoon, leaving Hannah and the twins sleeping to fetch the doctor. Garrett examined all 3 patients thoroughly, his experienced hands gentle but thorough. The girls are healthy, he pronounced, tucking the blanket back around them. Small, but fighters. Hannah, sitting propped against pillows, exhaled in relief. And Mrs. Whitaker will recover, though that cheekbone is indeed cracked. Garrett packed his medical bag, then fixed Hannah with a kind but direct gaze. You were very lucky, young lady. Another night in that cold, and we'd be having a very different conversation. Hannah's eyes flicked to Mason, who stood by the door, arms crossed. I know, she said softly. After examining Hannah, Garrett asked for a private word with Mason. They stepped outside onto the porch where snow had begun to fall again in lazy spirals. She's a Whitaker, Garrett asked without preamble. Mason nodded. By marriage. Her husband died recently. And you found her? Tied to a post with her children left to freeze. Family dispute, apparently. Garrett's expression darkened. The Whitakers always were a hard lot. He glanced back toward the cabin. She looks like Margaret. So Mason hadn't imagined it. You saw it too. The resemblance is striking. Garrett tugged his beard thoughtfully. Could be coincidence. Could be something else. Mason stared out at the falling snow. She called for Robert during her fever, begged him not to let them take her babies. Garrett's eyebrows rose. Robert Whitaker's been dead 10 years. I know. I'm the one who put him in the ground. Mason's voice was flat. Then she meant another Robert. Or her fever was worse than we thought. They stood in silence for a moment, breath clouding in the cold air. Finally, Garrett sighed. She's someone's daughter, Mason. Maybe someone on your list. The implication hung between them. Mason had killed 17 men at Gettysburg. 17 men who might have had daughters, sisters, wives. 17 lives that connected to countless others. The ripples of his actions spreading outward, touching lives he'd never know. What am I supposed to do with that? Mason asked quietly. Garrett placed a hand on his shoulder. The same thing you've been doing. Care for her. Help her heal. He paused. And maybe find out the truth. After Garrett left, Mason remained on the porch watching as the doctor's buggy disappeared down the snow-covered trail. The truth. What good would that do anyone now? If Hannah was connected to the Whitakers he'd known to Robert, or Margaret, learning that her children's savior was also her family's killer, would bring only fresh pain. Better to help her recover than send her on her way. Back to her sister, perhaps, or to another town where the Whitakers couldn't reach her. When Mason re-entered the cabin, Hannah was sitting up, one of the twins cradled in each arm. She looked up as he closed the door, her expression unreadable. The doctor says they owe you my life, she said, and the lives of my daughters. Mason hung his coat and moved to the fire, adding another log. You don't owe me anything. Nevertheless, Hannah shifted, wincing slightly. I don't know how to thank you. No need. Mason busied himself with the kettle, uncomfortable with gratitude. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the pop and hiss of the fire. Then Hannah spoke again, her voice hesitant. I found something while you were fetching the doctor. Mason turned. Hannah nodded toward the mantel where the photograph of Margaret and Robert Whitaker stood. You know the Whitakers, she said. It wasn't a question. Mason's throat tightened. I knew some Whitakers during the war. The war. Hannah's gaze dropped to her daughters. My father-in-law spoke of the war often, of the brother he lost at Gettysburg. Mason went very still. Your father-in-law, Robert Whitaker Sr. Hannah's eyes met his again. He died last year. My husband Michael was his son. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Mason gripped the back of a chair to steady himself. Robert Whitaker Sr., not the Robert he'd killed, not the man whose wooden doll now lay buried beneath the pine. I thought, Mason began, then stopped. The resemblance to the woman in the photograph. Hannah glanced at the picture again. Is that Margaret Roberts' sister? Mason nodded. I never met her. She died before I married into the family. Hannah studied the photograph. Michael said I reminded him of her. That's why his father accepted me at first. A shadow crossed her face. Until the twins came, and Michael was gone, and I was just another mouth to feed. The pieces rearranged themselves in Mason's mind. Hannah hadn't married as Robert Whitaker, but rather the son of a different Robert Whitaker, likely a cousin or uncle to the man Mason had killed. The resemblance to Margaret was explained by Hannah's connection to the family, and the Robert she'd called for in her fever was her father-in-law, not the young soldier who died at Gettysburg. Relief washed through him, followed immediately by shame. What did it matter which Whitaker she'd married? Her suffering was real, her abandonment cruel. The connection to his past was more distant than he'd feared, but still present. Your father-in-law, Mason said carefully, he let them do this to you. Hannah's expression hardened. Robert is dead. It was his brother Ezra who decided my fate. She looked down at her daughters. Ezra said girls bring nothing but expense, that the Whitaker name dies with them. Ezra, another name from Mason's past. Ezra Whitaker, Robert's older brother. The man who'd written to Mason after the war demanding to know the details of his brother's death. The man whose letter Mason had never answered. Ezra Whitaker, Mason said the name feeling like gravel in his mouth. He's still alive. Hannah nodded. He runs what's left of the family now, has a ranch about 20 miles south of here. She shivered despite the fire's warmth. He'll come looking eventually, when he learns I'm survived. Mason's hand moved unconsciously to his hip, where his sidearm would have hung during the war. Let him come. That night, after Hannah and the twins had fallen asleep, Mason took out his Bible. Its leather binding was worn smooth from years of handling its pages dog-eared and marked. His mother had given it to him before he left for war, inscribing the inside cover with words that had become both comfort and accusation for Mason for when the silence gets heavy. The silence had been heavy for 10 years. Heavy with the weight of 17 souls, heavy with the absence of forgiveness. Mason opened to where a folded paper lay tucked between the pages of Psalms. On it, 17 names written in his own hand. 16 now crossed out, including Robert Whitaker. One remaining, James Collins, a young Confederate no older than 17, shot as he surrendered. Beneath the list, another name Mason had added years later, Ezra Whitaker. Not because Mason had killed him, he hadn't, but because Ezra's letter had followed him across the country, demanding answers Mason couldn't give. Now, by some twist of fate, Mason couldn't begin to understand Ezra Whitaker's victim slept in his cabin. His grandchildren, twin girls with Margaret's eyes, breathed peacefully near the fire. Mason stared at the name for a long time. Then, by the light of a single candle, he began to read. Not the passages about vengeance or justice, but the ones about mercy, about redemption. The verses that felt, as he'd once told Hannah, like songs. Outside, the wind picked up, sending snow against the windows in soft patters. Inside, the fire burned steadily, keeping at bay both the cold and the darkness. Mason read until dawn, until the words blurred before his eyes, until the silence felt for the first time in years not quite so heavy. When Hannah woke the next morning, she found Mason carving by the window. Wood shavings littered the floor around his feet, and in his hands a small shell was emerging from a block of pine. One of the twins, the smaller one, watched him from her makeshift cradle, dark eyes following the movement of his knife. "What are you making, Ben?" Hannah asked, voice still rough with sleep. Mason looked up, momentarily startled, as if he'd forgotten he wasn't alone. "A rattle," he said, showing her the rough outline, "for the little ones." Hannah's expression softened. "They need names." Mason nodded, returning to his carving. "That they do. Fine." Hannah sat up slowly, testing her strength. The past few days had brought improvement, but she still moved like someone twice her age, every gesture measured to minimize pain. "I've been thinking," she said, gathering the quilt around her shoulders, "faith and grace." Mason's knife paused. "Biblical names." "Yes," Hannah looked toward the cradle. "Because it took faith to survive, and it was by grace that you found us." Something pulled tight in Mason's chest, an ache both familiar and strange. He nodded once, unable to speak. "Faith for the smaller one," Hannah continued. "She fought hardest to be born. And grace for her sister, who came into the world so quietly, the midwife thought she wasn't breathing at first." Mason studied the infant, watching him, Faith now. Her gaze was solemn, as if she understood the weight of the name being given to her. "Faith and grace," he repeated softly. "Good names, strong names." Hannah smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes despite the bruise still yellowing her cheek. "Thank you." Mason returned to his carving, but his thoughts remained on the names, faith and grace. Two things he'd abandoned long ago, believing himself unworthy of either. Now they lay before him in human form, two tiny lives that somehow, against all odds, had found their way to his door. Perhaps he thought, as his knife shaped the wood, this was what redemption looked like. Not grand gestures or divine forgiveness, but small moments of connection. A life saved, a name given. A fire kept burning through the longest night. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in white. Inside, Mason carved rattles for children who were not his own, while their mother watched with eyes that reminded him of ghosts he thought he'd buried. The silence between them was no longer empty. It had shape, now substance. It held within it the possibility of healing for Hannah for her daughters, and perhaps though Mason hardly dared to think it for himself as well. Days stretched into weeks. January deepened, bringing with it the kind of cold that cracked tree trunks and froze breath before it left the lungs. But inside Mason Sullivan's cabin, warmth persisted. The fire burned day and night, its light casting long shadows against log walls that had known only one man's presence for a decade. Now they witnessed something new healing. Hannah's strength returned gradually like spring thawing frozen ground. First she could sit up without pain, then stand, then walk the short distance from bed to fire. Each achievement, small but significant, marked by the quiet nod Mason gave when she managed something new. The twins thrived, their tiny bodies filling out pink, replacing the blue pallor they'd worn when Mason found them. They had distinct personalities already. Faith, the smaller one, fussed, more demanded attention with surprising force for one so small. Grace watched the world with solemn eyes, quieter but no less present. Mason carved for them small wooden animals that they were too young to play with, but seemed to enjoy watching as he placed them around their cradle. A bear, a rabbit, a horse with a crooked tail. His hands, once instruments of destruction, now created. The irony wasn't lost on him. One evening, as snow battered the windows and wind howled through the pines, Hannah sat in the chair Mason had given up for her. Faith slept in her arms while Grace lay in the cradle nearby. Mason knelt by the fire, adding another log, his movements deliberate as always. "I found your Bible," Hannah said quietly. Mason still then continued his task without looking up. "It was my mother's." "The inscription," Hannah continued, "for Mason, for when the silence gets heavy." She paused. "She understood you." Mason sat back on his heels, watching the flames catch on fresh wood. "She was the only one who did." "You read it often at night." He glanced at her, surprised. "How did you know?" "I've heard you when the twins wake me." Hannah shifted Faith to her other arm. "You read the same passages, the ones about forgiveness." Mason's jaw tightened. He stood brushing ash from his hands. "You should rest." "I've done nothing but rest for weeks." Hannah's voice, though soft, held an edge of frustration. "I'm not made of glass, Mr. Sullivan." "Mason," he corrected automatically. "Just Mason." A small victory lit her eyes. "Mason, then." He moved to the window, parting the rough curtain to peer out at the storm. Snow swirled in the darkness, obscuring everything beyond a few feet from the cabin. Winter's isolation, once his comfort, now felt like both protection and prison. "I read them because they help," he said, finally, still looking out at the night. "When the memories get loud." Hannah didn't ask which memories. Instead, she rose carefully and carried Faith to the cradle, settling her beside her sister. The twins stirred but didn't wake, small hands finding each other even in sleep. "My husband used to read scripture," she said, straightening, "but only the passages about obedience, about a woman's place." She smoothed the blanket over her daughters. "I prefer your selections." Mason turned from the window. Hannah stood in the firelight, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her face thinner than when he'd found her, but stronger now, more present. She no longer looked like someone waiting to die. "They're just words," he said. "No." Hannah shook her head. "The way you read them, like you're searching for something, hoping the answers are there if you just look hard enough." She met his gaze directly. "I know that feeling." Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement, unspoken but real, that they were both broken in ways others might not understand, both seeking something just beyond reach. Mason looked away first. "It's late," he said, moving toward the door where his coat hung. "I need to check the wood pile." Outside, the cold hit him like a physical blow, but he welcomed it. The clarity it brought, the simple challenge of survival that had structured his days for so long. He stood on the porch, letting snow settle on his shoulders, and tried to steady his breathing. Hannah Whitaker was getting under his skin, her quiet strength, her perception, the way she saw things in him he thought he'd buried. Mason trudged through knee-deep snow to the woodshed more to escape than from actual need. Inside, stacked logs weighted enough to last another month at least. He ran a hand over them, feeling the rough bark beneath his fingers. A sound outside made him freeze, something moving beyond the normal whisper of falling snow. Mason reached instinctively for the knife at his belt, then silently moved to the small window. Nothing but darkness and swirling white. Then a shadow darker than the rest moving between trees at the edge of the clearing. Person or animal, Mason couldn't tell. But the movement was deliberate, purposeful. He waited, barely breathing, for nearly 10 minutes. The shadow didn't reappear. Eventually, Mason gathered an armful of logs and returned to the cabin, alert now to any sound or movement. Hannah looked up when he entered, a concern crossing her face as she took in his expression. "What is it?" "Nothing," Mason said, setting the wood beside the hearth. "Just the storm." He didn't mention the shadow. No need to frighten her when it might have been nothing more than a deer or his imagination. But that night, after Hannah and the twins slept, Mason cleaned his rifle by firelight and kept it closer than usual, just in case. The next morning dawned clear and blindingly bright, the storm having passed in the night. Mason rose before dawn, as was his habit, and stepped outside to check the area around the cabin. Fresh snow had covered any tracks, but he circled the perimeter anyway, scanning the tree line for signs of disturbance. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched lingered. He was splitting wood when Reverend Williams arrived, the minister's ancient mule struggling through the deep snow. Williams was a tall, spare man with white hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent a lifetime outdoors. He'd been in Redemption Creek for as long as Mason could remember, though they'd spoken only a handful of times. "Mr. Sullivan," Williams called, raising a gloved hand in greeting. "Fine morning." Mason paused, axe raised mid-swing. "Reverend." Williams dismounted with the stiffness of age, then reached into his saddlebag. "Dr. Garrett asked me to bring these." He held out a package wrapped in brown paper. "Medicine for Mrs. Whitaker and the little ones." Mason set down his axe and approached, taking the package. "You didn't need to come all this way." Williams smiled, the expression crinkling his eyes at the corners. "I find winter rides clarify the mind, and I was curious about your guests." He nodded toward the cabin. "May I?" Mason hesitated, then nodded. Reverend Williams wasn't known for gossip, and his presence might do Hannah good. She hadn't spoken to anyone but Mason and Garrett since arriving. Inside, Hannah sat by the fire, one twin at her breast, while the other slept nearby. She startled at their entrance, quickly adjusting her shawl for modesty. "Mrs. Whitaker," Williams said, removing his hat, "please don't trouble yourself. I'm Reverend Williams from town." Hannah relaxed slightly. "Reverend." Mason set the package on the table. "Medicine from Garrett," he explained, and then returned outside to give them privacy, though he left the door ajar in case Hannah needed him. He continued splitting wood, the rhythmic swing and crack of the axe, a meditation of sorts. From inside came the murmur of conversation, occasionally punctuated by Williams's gentle laugh. Mason found himself listening for Hannah's responses, reassured by her voice, even when he couldn't make out the words. When Williams emerged nearly an hour later, his expression was thoughtful. He joined Mason by the woodpile, hands clasped behind his back. "She's been through a terrible ordeal," the minister said. Mason brought the axe down, splitting a log cleanly. "Yes. Yet her faith remains intact. Remarkable." Williams watched as Mason set up another log. "She speaks highly of you, Mr. Sullivan." Mason didn't respond, focusing on his task. "She says you read scripture at night." The axe paused mid-swing. "Is that a crime, Reverend?" Williams smiled. "Quite the opposite. I merely find it interesting." He paused. "She mentioned you favor passages about redemption." Mason split the log with more force than necessary, sending pieces flying. "Did she?" "Indeed." Williams bent to pick up a scattered chunk of wood, brushing snow from it before adding it to the pile. "We are all seeking it in our way." Redemption. He straightened, fixing Mason with a penetrating gaze. "Though some of us take more circuitous routes than others." Mason lowered the axe. What exactly are you getting at, Reverend? Nothing in particular. Williams adjusted his gloves, merely observing that God's grace works in unexpected ways, through unexpected people. He nodded toward the cabin. That young woman and her children were meant to survive, and you were meant to find them. I don't believe in destiny, Mason said flatly. No, Williams smiled again. Then call it providence, or coincidence if you prefer. He moved toward his mule. I'll return next week if you don't mean. Mrs. Whitaker expressed interest in having the twins properly baptized. Mason frowned. That's her decision. Of course, Williams mounted with some difficulty, and yours as their protector. Before Mason could object to this characterization, the minister had turned his mule and was making his way back down the trail, leaving Mason with the distinct impression he'd been outmaneuvered somehow. Inside, Hannah was changing grace, her movements gentle but efficient. Faith watched from the cradle, one tiny fist in her mouth. The Reverend seems kind, Hannah said without looking up. Mason hung his coat by the door. He talks too much. A smile tugged at Hannah's lips. Unlike some. Mason huffed almost a laugh, surprising himself. He moved to the stove and put the kettle on a routine that had developed over the weeks. Tea for Hannah, coffee for himself, tasks performed in a silence that had gradually become comfortable. He asked about you, Hannah said, settling Grace beside her sister. About your time in the war. Mason stilled. What did you tell him? That you don't speak of it. Hannah turned to face him. Was that wrong? No. Mason measured coffee grounds, focusing on the task. It was accurate. Hannah studied him, her head tilted slightly. He said people in town still call you Captain Sullivan sometimes. People talk too much. They say you were a hero. Mason's hand tightened on the coffee tin. They're wrong. Hannah approached slowly, stopping a few feet away. The Reverend said you saved many lives, that you received commendations. For taking lives, not saving them. The words came out harsher than he intended. Hannah didn't flinch. Is that why you live out here alone, because of what happened in the war? Mason set down the tin with deliberate care. Mrs. Whitaker, Hannah, she corrected. After all this time, surely you can use my name. He met her gaze. Hannah, there are things about me you don't know. Things better left buried. Like the wooden dolls, Mason froze. What? Hannah held his gaze. I found them, in the trunk at the foot of your bed. When I was looking for more blankets for the girls, she paused. 16 of them, all carved the same. Blood rushed in Mason's ears. The dolls, his private penance, the physical manifestations of his guilt, each one representing a life he'd taken. 16 buried, one still waiting. You had no right, he said, voice low. I know. Hannah didn't look away. I'm sorry, but I've been wondering. Don't. Mason turned back to the stove, hands gripping its edge. Please. The cabin fell silent save for the crackle of the fire and the occasional soft sound from the twins. Mason stood rigid, waiting for questions he couldn't answer, accusations he deserved. Instead, he felt a light touch on his arm. Hannah stood beside him, her expression not judging, but concerned. Whatever burden you carry, she said softly, you don't have to bear it alone. Mason looked down at her hand on his arm, small but strong, the hand of a woman who'd survived abandonment and near death, who'd fought for her children when she had every reason to give up. Some burdens can't be shared, he said finally. Hannah withdrew her hand. Perhaps, but they can be witnessed. She returned to the twins, leaving Mason with a hollow feeling in his chest that had nothing to do with hunger. February arrived with a brief thaw. Snow melted during the day, only to refreeze at night, creating a treacherous crust that crunched underfoot. The creek behind Mason's cabin, frozen solid for weeks, began to gurgle beneath its icy surface. In town, people emerged from winter isolation, eager for fresh air and news. Mason avoided Redemption Creek when possible, sending Hannah's needs to Garrett via Reverend Williams, who now visited weekly. But eventually supplies ran low enough to necessitate a trip. He left early one morning, promising to return by nightfall. Hannah stood on the porch as he mounted his horse, Faith bundled in her arms while Grace slept inside. "Be careful," she said, adjusting Faith's blanket against the cold. Mason nodded, struck again by how natural she looked there on his porch in the morning light, as if she belonged, as if they all did. "Bar the door while I'm gone," he said, "and keep the rifle close." Hannah's eyebrows rose. "You still think someone's watching the cabin?" It wasn't a question. Mason had never mentioned his suspicions, but Hannah was observant. She'd noticed his increased vigilance, the extra rounds he made checking the perimeter, the way he positioned himself between the windows and the twins each evening. "Just a precaution," he said. Hannah bounced Faith gently as the baby fussed. "Ezra won't have forgotten about us." "No," Mason agreed. "He won't have." Their eyes met in shared understanding. Ezra Whitaker was not a man who forgave, nor one who forgot. If he learned Hannah and the twins had survived, he would come. It was only a matter of time. "We'll be fine," Hannah assured him. "Faith, Grace, and I have survived worse than a day without you." Something in her tone made Mason look at her more closely. There was strength there, yes, but also a hint of something else. Affection, perhaps, or simply the comfort of familiarity. Either way, it unsettled him. "I'll be back before dark," he repeated, then turned his horse and rode away without looking back, though he felt Hannah's gaze following him until the trail curved out of sight. Redemption Creek was busier than Mason had seen it in months. Wagons lined the muddy street and the general store buzzed with activity. He hitched his horse and entered, nodding to the proprietor, a heavy-set man named Jenkins, who'd learned years ago that Mason preferred minimal conversation. Today, however, Jenkins seemed determined to talk. "Captain Sullivan," and he called as Mason gathered supplies. "Heard you've got yourself some house guests." Mason didn't look up. News travels fast. "Small town." Jenkins leaned on the counter. "They say it's a Whitaker widow and her babes." "They say a lot of things," Jenkins chuckled. "True enough. Still must be nice having some company out there after all these years." Mason placed his items on the counter. "Will that be all, Jenkins?" The shopkeeper's smile faded at Mason's tone. Sure, just making conversation." He began tallying the purchases. "Though you might want to know, Ezra Whitaker was in town yesterday." Mason went still. What did he want? Asking questions about a missing daughter-in-law and granddaughters. Jenkins looked up, his expression suddenly serious. "Said they disappeared after his son's funeral, that he feared foul play." Cold settled in Mason's stomach. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing to tell. Far as I knew, no one matching that description had come through town." Jenkins wrapped Mason's purchases in brown paper. "But Whitaker's no fool. He'll keep looking." "Who else did he speak to?" "Everyone who'd listen. Offered a reward, too." Jenkins tied the package with string. Garrett sent him packing, told him to take his questions elsewhere. But Eleanor Fletcher was mighty interested. Mason frowned. "Eleanor Fletcher, widow who lives on the edge of town, keeps to herself mostly like you." Jenkins pushed the package across the counter. "Has no love for the Whitakers, but $20 is $20. Mason paid and gathered his supplies, mind racing. Eleanor Fletcher. He'd seen her in town occasionally, a stern-faced woman who always wore black even years after her husband's death. He knew little about her beyond her reputation for being particular about everything from the cut of meat she bought to the hymns sung in church. "Where does Mrs. Fletcher live?" he asked, trying to sound casual. Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "Cabin about a mile east of town. Can't miss it, has a red door and more cats than sense." He leaned forward. "Why planning a social call, Captain?" Mason ignored the question. "Thanks for the information," he said, and left before Jenkins could ask anything else. The Fletcher cabin was exactly as described, small but well-maintained, with a freshly painted red door that stood out against the weathered logs. A half-dozen cats scattered as Mason approached, disappearing beneath the porch or into nearby bushes. Eleanor Fletcher answered his knock immediately, as if she'd been waiting. She was tall for a woman with steel gray hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. "Captain Sullivan," she said, no surprise in her tone. "I wondered when you'd come." Mason adjusted the rifle slung over his shoulder. "Mrs. Fletcher, you'd better come in." She stepped aside. "Before my cats decide to adopt you." The interior of Eleanor's cabin was surprisingly cozy, quilts draped over furniture, dried herbs hanging from rafters, a fire burning in a well-swept hearth. It smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke. "Sit," Eleanor instructed, pointing to a chair. "I'll make tea." Mason remained standing. "I'd rather not waste time on pleasantries, Mrs. Fletcher." Eleanor paused in the act of reaching for the kettle. "Direct. I appreciate that." She straightened, facing him. "You want to know what I told Ezra Whitaker?" "Yes." "Nothing useful." Eleanor crossed her arms. "I said I'd keep an eye out for his missing family, but that was all." Mason studied her, looking for signs of deception. "Why would you agree to help him at all? Jenkins said you had no love for the Whitakers." "I don't." Eleanor's expression hardened. "Ezra Whitaker is a cruel man who uses God's word to justify his own meanness. But $20 buys a lot of cat food, Captain. And information about a woman and two baby girls. What's that worth?" Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "More than Ezra Whitaker could ever pay." She moved to a small bureau and opened a drawer, withdrawing something Mason couldn't see. "I lost twin daughters once. Did you know that?" Mason shook his head. "Fever took them. They were 4. Eleanor returned, holding a small daguerreotype in a tarnished frame. Two identical little girls in white dresses stared solemnly at the camera. "No one in town knows. It happened before we moved here." She placed the picture carefully on the table. "So you see, Captain, I have no intention of helping Ezra Whitaker find that young woman and her babies. Quite the opposite, in fact." Relief washed through Mason, though he kept his expression neutral. "Then why tell me about your daughters?" "Because," Eleanor said, meeting his gaze directly, "I want you to tell Hannah Whitaker that she isn't alone. That there's at least one other woman in this world who understands what it means to raise twin girls in a place that doesn't value them." She paused. "And I want her to know that if she ever needs help, the kind only another woman can provide, my door is open." Mason absorbed this, re-evaluating the stern widow before him. "You're taking a risk, Mrs. Fletcher. Ezra Whitaker doesn't forgive those who cross him." A cold smile touched Eleanor's lips. "Neither do I, Captain. Neither do I." When Mason left Eleanor Fletcher's cabin, the sun had already begun its descent. He rode faster than was wise on the icy trail, concern for Hannah and the twins growing with each passing mile. If Ezra was asking questions in town, offering rewards, it wouldn't be long before someone talked. Someone always did. The shadows were lengthening when Mason finally rounded the bend that brought his cabin into view. He reined in abruptly. 3 horses were tied to his porch rail. Mason dismounted quietly, securing his own horse a distance away. He unslung his rifle, checked that it was loaded, and approached on foot, using the trees for cover. Voices carried in the clear air, a man's angry and demanding, followed by Hannah's too low to make out the words. Mason crept closer until he could see the cabin clearly. 3 men stood on his porch. 2 were strangers, young, rough-looking men with the hard eyes of those accustomed to violence. The third, older and broader, Mason recognized immediately, despite the decade that had passed. Ezra Whitaker. He stood with his back to the door, blocking it. Hannah faced him, one twin clutched to her chest, the other presumably inside. Her stance was defensive, her chin raised in defiance, despite the fear Mason could see even at this distance. "They belong to the Whitaker family," Ezra was saying, his voice carrying clearly now. "You have no right to keep them from their blood." Their blood left them to die, Hannah replied, her voice steady. You left us to die. Ezra took a step forward. The Lord tests those he loves, daughter. You were meant to prove your worth. By freezing to death with my children. Hannah didn't retreat. What kind of God do you worship, Ezra? A just one. Ezra gestured to the men flanking him. Now you can come willingly or what? Mason emerged from the trees, rifle raised. You'll force her 3 armed men against 1 woman and 2 infants. Very brave. All 3 men turned hands, moving to their weapons. Hannah's eyes widened, relief washing over her face. Who the hell are you? One of the younger men demanded. This is my property, Mason said, continuing his approach. And you're trespassing. Ezra squinted, studying Mason's face. Recognition slowly dawned in his eyes. Sullivan, he said, the name like poison on his tongue. Mason Sullivan. Mason stopped a dozen paces away, rifle still trained on the group. Ezra Whitaker. You know each other. Hannah looked between them, confusion replacing relief. We've never met, Mason said, not taking his eyes off Ezra. But we've corresponded. Corresponded, Ezra spat. Is that what you call it? I wrote you a dozen letters demanding to know how my brother died. You never answered. Understanding dawned on Hannah's face. Robert, she whispered. You knew Robert Whitaker. He killed him, Ezra said, his voice shaking with rage. Shot him at Gettysburg when Robert was trying to surrender. Murdered him in cold blood. Mason's finger tensed on the trigger. You don't know what happened that day. I know my brother wrote home about the Yankee captain who executed prisoners. Called you the angel of death. Ezra's hand moved to his own gun. And now I find you've taken in my son's widow and my granddaughters. Is this your idea of atonement, Sullivan stealing what's left of my family? I found them tied to a post in the snow, Mason said, voice dangerously quiet. Left to die by their loving family. I did what any decent man would do. Decent, Ezra laughed, a harsh sound. There's nothing decent about you, Sullivan. You're a murderer hiding in the wilderness because you can't face what you've done. The accusation hit like a physical blow, all the more painful for its kernel of truth. Mason steadied his rifle. Walk away, Whitaker. Take your men and go before this ends badly. Ezra's eyes narrowed. Hannah and the girls are coming with us. Family belongs with family. No. Hannah stepped forward, still clutching faith to her chest. We're staying here. You don't have a choice, girl, Ezra growled. You're a Whitaker by marriage, and those children carry our blood. My children carry my blood too, Hannah said, her voice gaining strength, and I choose to keep them safe, away from you. Tension crackled in the air like electricity before a storm. Mason could see the younger men shifting nervously, hands hovering near their guns. One wrong move, one twitch of a finger, and this would end in bloodshed. Ezra, Mason said, deliberately using the man's first name, you've lost one brother to violence. Do you want to lose these men too? He nodded toward the nervous pair. Because I promise you, if you draw those weapons, I'll bury 3 more men before supper. Uncertainty flickered across Ezra's face. He glanced at his companions, then back at Mason, measuring the threat. You always were good at killing Sullivan, he said finally. Made quite a name for yourself at Gettysburg. Mason didn't respond, keeping his rifle steady. After what felt like an eternity, Ezra stepped back from the door. This isn't over, he said, looking at Hannah. Those girls are Whitakers. They belong with their people. These are their people, Hannah replied, nodding toward Mason. The ones who saved them, who value them. Fury twisted Ezra's features, but he motioned to his men. Mount up. The 3 retreated to their horses, keeping a wary eye on Mason's rifle. As they prepared to ride away, Ezra turned back. You know what's funny, Sullivan? All these years I've hated you for killing my brother, dreamed of making you pay. A cold smile touched his lips. But now I see God's got a better punishment in mind. He's made you care for something. Given you something to lose. His gaze shifted to Hannah and Faith. Sleep light, Captain. We'll be seeing each other again. With that, Ezra wheeled his horse and rode away, his men close behind. Mason kept his rifle raised until they disappeared from sight, then quickly moved to Hannah's side. Are you all right? Did they hurt you? Hannah shook her head, her composure finally cracking. They just showed up, demanded we go with them. I managed to get inside with Grace, but Ezra caught me when I tried to go back for Faith. Her arms tightened around the baby. If you hadn't come when you did. I'm here now, Mason said, guiding her inside. Let's get you both warm. Once the door was barred, Hannah placed Faith beside her sister in the cradle. Both twins were remarkably calm despite the confrontation, as if they sensed the need for quiet. Mason added wood to the fire, trying to still the trembling in his hands, not from fear, but from how close they'd come to disaster, how close he'd come to failing Hannah and the girls. Is it true? Hannah asked quietly, still standing by the cradle. What Ezra said about Robert. Mason closed the stove door with a snap. Some of it. Which parts? He turned to face her, knowing he owed her the truth. I killed Robert Whitaker at Gettysburg. He was one of 17 men who died by my hand that day. Mason's voice was flat, emotionless. They called me the angel of death afterward, said I executed prisoners. Hannah's expression remained neutral. Did you? No. Mason moved to the mantel, touching the frame that held Margaret's photograph. They weren't prisoners. They were soldiers who'd been ordered to surrender, but their commander had placed sharpshooters behind them. As our men approached to take them into custody, the sharpshooters opened fire. He closed his eyes, seeing it all again. 14 Union soldiers died in that ambush. Good men, friends. And you retaliated. Hannah said, not a question. Mason nodded. I gave the order to fire. 17 Confederate soldiers died, including Robert Whitaker. He opened his eyes, meeting Hannah's gaze. I didn't know who he was then. Just another enemy uniform. Another threat to my men. But you found out later. Yes. Mason's hand dropped from the photograph. After the war, Ezra wrote to me, demanding details, wanting to know if his brother had suffered. He shook his head. I never answered. What could I say? That I remembered the look in his eyes as he fell, that I still see it in my dreams. Hannah approached slowly, stopping arm's length away. The wooden dolls, she said. They're for them, aren't they? The men you killed. Yes. Mason's voice was barely audible. One for each, carved in their memory, buried on the anniversary of their deaths. A penance, Hannah murmured. An acknowledgement, Mason corrected, that their lives mattered, that taking them had a cost. Hannah was silent for a long moment, processing this revelation. Mason waited for her judgment, her fear, her rejection. Waited for her to see him as he truly was, not a hero, not a protector, but a man with blood on his hands that would never wash clean. Instead, she asked, how many dolls are left? Mason blinked, surprised by the question. One. Just one. Hannah's eyes softened. After all this time, just one remains. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Hannah closed the distance between them and, to Mason's astonishment, took his hand. Her fingers were small but warm against his calloused palm. You've been carrying this alone for so long, she said quietly. This guilt, this pain. Mason looked down at their joined hands, feeling unworthy of the contact. It's my burden to bear. Perhaps, Hannah's grip tightened, but you took on our burden without hesitation. You saved us when no one else would. She glanced toward the cradle where Faith and Grace slept peacefully, unaware of how close they'd come to being taken. Maybe it's time you allowed someone to help carry yours. Something broke inside Mason, then some wall he'd built years ago to contain his grief, his guilt, his loneliness. He didn't cry, he'd forgotten how, but his shoulders sagged, as if the weight he'd carried for a decade had suddenly doubled. Hannah didn't speak again. She simply stood with him, her hand in his, offering what no one else had in all these years. Not absolution, not forgiveness, just presence, just witness to his pain. Outside, twilight deepened into night. Snow began to fall again, soft flakes that drifted past the window like ghosts. Inside, the fire burned steadily, keeping at bay both darkness and cold. And for the first time since Gettysburg, Mason Sullivan didn't feel completely alone. The days following Ezra's visit passed in a state of heightened vigilance. Mason reinforced the cabin door, added shutters to the windows, and kept his rifle within reach at all times. He slept little, waking at the slightest sound, the creak of a branch, the whisper of wind, the soft murmur of the twins in their sleep. Hannah noticed the dark circles forming beneath his eyes, but said nothing. She had her own fears to contend with. When she thought Mason wasn't looking, she'd stand by the window scanning the tree line, hands trembling slightly before she steadied them. At night, she slept with the twins between herself and the door, as if her body could shield them from whatever might come. They spoke little of what had happened, of the revelations about Mason's past, or the threat Ezra had left hanging in the air. Some things were too raw, too close to the bone. Instead, they focused on the practical, keeping the fire burning, caring for the twins surviving the last bitter weeks of winter. One morning in late February, Mason found Hannah sitting at the table staring at the wooden dolls he'd finally shown her. All 17 were lined up in a row, 16 rough or older, the last one newly carved and waiting. She touched each one gently as if they were fragile, precious things. "You remember all their names?" she said without looking up. It wasn't a question. Mason leaned against the doorframe. "Yes." "And this is the last one." Hannah indicated the newest doll, its wood still pale compared to the others. "James Collins." Mason said the name familiar on his tongue after all these years. 17 years old, carried a Bible in his pocket. Hannah picked up the doll, studying its simple features. "When will you bury it?" "April 12th, the anniversary." She nodded, setting the doll back in its place. "And then what?" Mason had asked himself the same question countless times over the years. What came after the final doll was buried, the final debt acknowledged? What purpose would his life have then? "I don't know," he admitted. Hannah looked up at Ian, then her gaze steady. "Yes, you do." Before Mason could respond, a knock at the door sent them both into motion. Hannah gathering the twins, Mason reaching for his rifle. But the visitor wasn't Ezra or his men. It was Reverend Williams, snow dusting his shoulders, his face grave. "Forgive the intrusion," the minister said, stamping his boots on the porch. "But I bring news that couldn't wait." Inside, Williams removed his hat and gloves, accepting the coffee Hannah offered. His eyes lingered on the row of wooden dolls still laid out on the table, but he made no comment. "Dubois, Garrett sent me," he began, wrapping cold hands around the warm mug. "A letter arrived for Mrs. Whitaker, from Chicago." Hannah's head snapped up. "From my sister." Williams nodded, reaching inside his coat to withdraw an envelope. "Sarah Collins, yes. The doctor thought it prudent to bring it directly to you rather than risk it falling into the wrong hands." Hannah took the letter with trembling fingers, breaking the seal immediately. Mason watched her face as she read hope, relief, then something more complicated passing across her features. "Sarah wants me to come to Chicago," she said, finally lowering the letter. "She says she's inherited a house from our grandfather, that there's room for me and the girls, a nursemaid to help, a fresh start." Something cold settled in Mason's chest. He'd known this day would come, had expected it even. Hannah was young with her whole life ahead of her. Of course she would want to leave this isolated cabin, this dangerous situation. Of course she would want her daughters to grow up in a proper home with opportunities that Redemption Creek could never offer. Yet the thought of the cabin without them, without Hannah's quiet strength, without Faith's determined fussing, and Grace's solemn stare left him hollow. Williams looked between them. "Chicago is a long journey," he said carefully, "but perhaps a timely one given recent developments." "Ezra won't give up," Mason agreed, forcing the words past the tightness in his throat. "He'll come again. With more men next time. Hannah folded the letter slowly, her expression unreadable. I need time to think. Of course. Williams rose, sensing the tension in the room. I should return before the weather worsens. He paused at the door. Mrs. Whitaker, Captain Sullivan, whatever you decide, know that you have friends in town, people who care about your welfare. After the minister left, silence filled the cabin. Hannah moved about preparing the midday meal while Mason took the wooden dolls and returned them to their hiding place. Neither spoke the weight of the letter and its implications hanging between them. That evening, after the twins were asleep, Hannah finally broke the silence. When I first came here, she said, sitting by the fire, I didn't expect to live through the night. I thought the cold would take me and then the girls. She looked up at Mason, who stood by the window, keeping watch as had become his habit. But you saved us. You gave us shelter, food, protection, a home. Mason turned from the window. It was the right thing to do. Was it? Hannah's voice was soft. Or was it penance, one more wooden doll to carve, only this time with breath still in its lungs? The question hit with the force of truth. Had he saved Hannah and the twins out of simple human decency, or had it been another form of atonement, a desperate attempt to balance the scales that could never truly be balanced? I don't know, he answered honestly. Maybe both. Hannah nodded, accepting his uncertainty. My sister's offer is generous. The girls would have opportunities in Chicago they could never have here. They would be safe, Mason said. From Ezra. From the past. Would they? Hannah's gaze was penetrating. Or would they simply be running from one danger into others we can't foresee? Mason had no answer for that. The world was full of dangers, especially for women alone. Even with her sister's protection, Hannah would face challenges, prejudice, hardship, the possibility of further rejection. You should go, he said finally, the words scraping his throat like gravel. For their sake, if not your own. Hannah studied him for a long moment. Is that what you want, Mason, for us to leave? Want. Such a simple word for such a complex feeling. What did Mason Sullivan want? After a decade of isolation, of penance, of emptiness, what did he dare to want? What I want doesn't matter, he said. Your safety does. The girl's future does. Hannah rose and approached him, stopping just out of reach. It matters to me, she said quietly. What you want matters to me. The admission hung in the air between them, fragile as a soap bubble. Mason looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the strength in her slight frame, the determination in her eyes, the quiet dignity that suffering had not diminished. I want you to be safe, he said finally. I want faith and grace to grow up without fear, without shadows. He swallowed hard, even if that means growing up without me. Something shifted in Hannah's expression, disappointment perhaps, or resignation. She nodded once, then returned to her seat by the fire, leaving Mason with the cold clarity of having done the right thing and the hollow ache of impending loss. The next morning, Mason began preparations for Hannah's departure. He mended a trunk he'd found in the root cellar, oiled its hinges, lined it with his spare blanket. He counted out money he'd saved over the years, not much, but enough for train tickets and food for the journey. He wrote a letter to a former comrade in Chicago asking him to watch over Hannah and her daughters if needed. Hannah observed these activities with a quiet intensity, but said nothing. She fed the twins, sang to them, held them close as if memorizing their tiny features. When Mason placed the trunk beside the door, she looked at it for a long moment, then turned away. I'll ride into town tomorrow, Mason said, keeping his voice steady. Arrange for a wagon to take you to the train station in Cheyenne. Hannah nodded, not meeting his eyes. Thank you. That night, as snow fell outside the cabin windows, Mason sat at the table cleaning his rifle. Hannah had gone to bed early, the twins nestled beside her in the cot that had once been his. He watched the rise and fall of their breathing, 3 lives entrusted to his care for a brief season, soon to continue their journey without him. It was better this way, he told himself. Safer. The girls deserved a life untainted by violence and death. They deserved a guardian whose hands were clean, whose past didn't threaten their future. And Hannah deserved a chance at happiness, at a life beyond survival. Mason finished with the rifle and set it aside. Then, by the light of a single candle, he took out the 17th doll, James Collins, the last name on his list, the last debt to pay. As he studied the simple wooden figure, a realization struck him. After this doll was buried, his penance would be complete. The ritual that had structured his life for a decade would end. What then? What purpose would drive him forward? The answer came with unexpected clarity. Nothing. Without Hannah and the twins, without his ritual of remembrance, Mason Sullivan would simply exist. A ghost among the living, haunting a cabin in the wilderness until death finally claimed him. The thought should have frightened him. Instead, it brought a strange peace. Perhaps that was justice after all, not death, but emptiness. A life without connection, without purpose, without love. A fitting end for the angel of death. Mason was still sitting at the table when dawn broke, the doll clutched in his hand, his mind quiet with acceptance. He rose stiffly, muscles protesting the night of inactivity, and moved to stoke the fire. The day Hannah would leave had arrived. He prepared breakfast, as usual, coffee for himself, tea for Hannah, warm milk for the twins. When Hannah emerged from the bedroom, her eyes were red-rimmed but dry. She'd braided her hair and wore her best dress, the one Mason had bought from the general store last month, dark blue with small white flowers at the collar. "You look nice," he said, the words inadequate but sincere. "Thank you." Hannah accepted the tea, her fingers brushing his in the exchange. For everything. They ate in silence, the only sounds the occasional coo from the twins and the crackle of the fire. Outside, the day promised fair weather for travel, clear skies, no wind, the snow beginning to melt in patches where sunlight touched it. Mason was washing the breakfast dishes when he heard it, the distant thunder of hooves, multiple horses approaching fast. He dropped the plate he was holding and reached for his rifle. "Get the twins," he ordered, all warmth gone from his voice. "Into the bedroom, now." Hannah didn't question him. She gathered faith and grace, disappearing into the back room as Mason moved to the window. Through a gap in the curtains, he could see them coming, 5 riders, Ezra Whitaker in the lead, rifles drawn. No warning this time, no demands. They meant to take Hannah and the girls by force. Mason barred the door, then positioned himself where he could see both the entrance and the bedroom. His mind was clear-focused. He'd been in this position before, outnumbered, outgunned, with leaps depending on his decisions. "Mason," Hannah's voice came from the bedroom doorway. "How many?" "5," he answered, not taking his eyes from the window. "Ezra and 4 others, armed." Hannah inhaled sharply. "What do we do?" "We fight," Mason said simply. "Can you shoot?" "Yes, Michael taught me." "Good." Mason nodded toward his hunting rifle propped in the corner. "That's loaded. 5 shots. Make them count." Hannah retrieved the rifle, checking it with practiced hands. Mason felt a surge of admiration for her composure, her readiness to defend her children. "They're coming for the back door," he warned, seeing 2 riders circle around. "Get behind the bed. Use it for cover." Hannah nodded and disappeared into the bedroom. Mason positioned himself by the front window, rifle ready. Outside, Ezra and 2 men had dismounted, spreading out to approach the cabin from different angles. The first shot came from the back, a window shattering glass spraying across the floor. Hannah returned fire immediately, the sound deafening in the small space. A cry of pain told Mason her aim had been true. Then all hell broke loose. Bullets tore through the front door, splintering wood. Mason fired back, dropping one of Ezra's men with a shot to the shoulder. The man fell, scrambling for cover beneath the porch steps. "Hannah," Mason called, ducking as another bullet whizzed past his head. "We're all right," she answered, her voice steady despite the chaos. "One down in the back. 4 against 2 now. Better odds, but still dangerous." Mason reloaded, mind racing through options. They couldn't sustain a prolonged firefight, ammunition was limited, and the cabin offered little protection against determined attackers. A moment of silence fell, broken only by the twins' frightened cries from the bedroom. Then Ezra's voice rang out. "Sullivan, send out Hannah and the girls, and we'll let you live." Mason didn't bother responding. Ezra's word meant nothing. "You hear me, Sullivan? This doesn't have to end with more blood on your hands." The taunt hit its mark, but Mason pushed aside the doubt it triggered. This wasn't Gettysburg. These weren't soldiers following orders. These were men intent on taking Hannah against her will, on claiming her children as property. "Hannah," Mason called, keeping his voice low, "can you see the horses from your window?" "Yes," she replied after a moment. "They're tied to the big pine about 50 yards out. If I create a diversion, could you reach them?" A pause. "I think so. But Mason—" "Get ready," he cut her off. "When I say go, take the girls and run for the horses. Don't stop. Don't look back. Ride for town." Before Hannah could argue, Mason moved to the fireplace and grabbed a burning log. In one fluid motion, he kicked open the front door and hurled the flaming wood onto the porch where a stack of kindling waited. The dry wood caught immediately, sending up a wall of smoke and flame. Startled shouts came from Ezra and his men as they scrambled away from the blaze. "Now, Hannah," Mason shouted, laying down covering fire as he backed toward the bedroom. "Go." Hannah appeared beside him, a twin clutched in each arm, face set with determination. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you," Mason lied. "Go." She hesitated for only a second, then nodded and slipped out the back door, keeping low. Mason continued firing, forcing Ezra's men to keep their heads down as Hannah made her dash for the horses. He was so focused on covering her escape that he didn't see the figure moving along the side of the cabin, didn't notice the threat until it was too late. The bullet took him high in the shoulder, spinning him around with its force. Mason staggered, firing blindly as he fell. His head struck the edge of the table, and darkness swallowed him. When Mason opened his eyes, he was sure he was dreaming. The cabin ceiling swam above him, firelight dancing across the familiar logs. But something was wrong. The angle was different, and the pain, sharp, throbbing pain in his shoulder and head, that was new. "Don't move," a woman's voice instructed. Not Hannah's, older, crisper. "You'll tear the stitches." Mason blinked, trying to clear his vision. Eleanor Fletcher came into focus, her stern face lined with concern as she bent over him. "Mrs. Fletcher," he croaked, mouth dry as cotton. "Drink," she ordered, holding a cup to his lips. Water, blessedly cool, slid down his throat. Slowly now. As his mind cleared, panic surged through him. Hannah, the twins. "Safe," Eleanor assured him, pressing him back down when he tried to rise. "They're with Reverend Williams in town. No one will touch them there." Relief made Mason dizzy, or perhaps that was the blood loss. "Ezra, shot in the leg. Not by you." A grim smile touched Eleanor's lips. "That was my doing. The others ran like the cowards they are." Mason struggled to piece together what had happened. "You were here during the attack." Eleanor nodded, wringing out a cloth in a basin beside the bed. "I arrived just as Hannah was making for the horses. Saw you go down. Figured it was time someone evened the odds a bit." She placed the cool cloth on Mason's forehead. "Good thing I'm a better shot than most men give women credit for." "Thank you," Mason whispered, the words inadequate for what she'd done. Eleanor waved away his gratitude. "I told you before I have no love for Ezra Whitaker, and I've buried enough children in my life." She checked the bandage on his shoulder. "The bullet went clean through. You're lucky. Another inch to the right, and we wouldn't be having this conversation." Mason closed his eyes, letting the information settle. Hannah and the twins were safe. Ezra was wounded, and he, Mason Sullivan, was alive thanks to a widow he barely knew. "How long," he asked, meaning how long he'd been unconscious. "2 days," Eleanor replied, understanding. "You lost a lot of blood. Garrett wasn't sure you'd make it that first night." 2 days. Mason tried to sit up again, more slowly this time. "I need to see them." You need to rest, Eleanor countered, but her tone had softened. Hannah knows you're alive. She'll come when it's safe. Mason subsided, too weak to argue. His thoughts turned to Hannah's planned departure. Had she already left for Chicago? Had his injury delayed her journey or hastened it? As if reading his mind, Eleanor said, "That trunk by the door. Hannah was leaving." Mason nodded slightly, wincing at the pain the movement caused. Her sister in Chicago offered her a home there. Eleanor's expression was thoughtful. And you were just going to let her go? It wasn't a question, but Mason answered anyway. It's safer for her, for the girls. Is it? Eleanor pinned him with a penetrating gaze. Running never solved anything, Captain. Believe me, I've tried it. Before Mason could respond, a knock at the door brought Eleanor to her feet, hand moving to the pistol at her waist. Who is it? She called. Reverend Defoyum, came the reply, with Hannah and the children. Eleanor unbarred the door, revealing the minister, Hannah, and the twins bundled against the cold. Hannah's eyes found Mason, immediately relief washing over her face when she saw him awake. Mason, she breathed, rushing to his bedside, faith clutched to her chest while the minister carried Grace. You're alive. Takes more than Ezra Whitaker to kill me, Mason said, attempting humor despite the pain. Are you all right, the girls? We're fine. And Hannah sat on the edge of the bed, her free hand finding his. Thanks to you and Mrs. Fletcher. Eleanor snorted. Don't thank me yet. Ezra's still breathing, more's the pity, though he won't be walking right for some time. Reverend Williams cleared his throat. Ezra Whitaker has been arrested by the territorial marshal. Attempted murder, among other charges. He bounced Grace gently as she fussed. His companions have fled, but the marshal is tracking them. It's over then, Mason said, hardly daring to believe it. For now, Williams agreed. But Ezra has friends, connections. He may not stay in custody long. Hannah's hand tightened on Mason's. All the more reason for us to leave quickly. She looked at Mason, her expression resolute. As soon as you're well enough to travel. Mason frowned confusion, cutting through the haze of pain. Us, yes, us, Hannah confirmed. You, me, Faith, Grace, all of us. But Chicago, Mason protested. Your sister. The opportunities for the girls. Hannah shook her head. I never intended to go to Chicago alone, Mason. I was waiting for you to ask to come with us. A shadow crossed her face, but you didn't. You just prepared to send us away. Mason stared at her, stunned. I assumed you wouldn't want a man with blood on his hands. Hannah finished for him. A man who has nightmares and carries guilt like a second skin. Her voice softened. Or a man who saved my children from freezing, who fed us, clothed us, protected us without asking anything in return. Mason couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the implications of her words. Hannah wanted him to come with them, had been waiting for him to ask. I'll leave you two to talk, Eleanor said tactfully, ushering Reverend Williams toward the door. Come, Reverend. I believe these children could use some fresh air. When they were alone, Hannah set Faith beside Mason on the bed. The baby immediately reached for his beard, tiny fingers grasping at the coarse hair. She knows you, Hannah said softly. Even after just 2 days away, she knows you. Mason's throat tightened as Faith gurgled happily, oblivious to the gravity of the moment. Hannah, I'm not the right man to help raise these girls. My past is past. Hannah interrupted. We all have things we regret, Mason. Choices we would unmake if we could. She touched his bandaged shoulder gently. But we can't change what's behind us. We can only decide what lies ahead. Mason looked at Faith, then at Hannah, seeing in her eyes a conviction that shook him to his core. I've done terrible things, he whispered. So have I, Hannah replied. I've hated. I've wished death on those who hurt me. She took a deep breath. But I'm trying to be better, to build something good from the ashes of what was lost. Her gaze held his. Isn't that what you want too? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. What did Mason Sullivan want? After all these years of penance, of isolation, of carrying the dead with him in wooden form, what did he dare to want for himself? Yes, he admitted finally, the word barely audible. But I don't know if I deserve it. Hannah's expression softened. None of us get what we deserve, Mason. Not really. We get what we're brave enough to accept. She took his hand, placing it over Faith's tiny chest so he could feel the strong heartbeat beneath. This is life. Real, messy, beautiful life. Not carved wood, not memory, not guilt. Mason felt it then, the steady thrum of Faith's heart against his palm, the warmth of Hannah's hand over his, the weight of the moment precious and fleeting. I want to come with you, he said, the words rushing out before fear could silence them. If you'll have me, if you think I can be what the girls need, what you need. Hannah's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. That's all I wanted to hear, she whispered, leaning forward to press her forehead against his. That's all I've been waiting for. It took 2 weeks for Mason to recover enough for travel. During that time, Eleanor Fletcher became a regular presence in the cabin, helping Hannah with the twins, changing Mason's bandages, keeping watch for any sign of Ezra's men. Dr. Guerin visited every few days, monitoring Mason's healing with gruff approval. You're tougher than you look, Solly, he remarked during one examination. Might make it to Chicago after all. But as Mason's strength returned, so did his doubts. The idea of leaving Wyoming, the only home he'd known since the war, filled him with equal parts hope and terror. What awaited him in Chicago? Could he truly start fresh? Build a life with Hannah and the twins when he still carried the weight of 17 souls? One evening, as Hannah bathed the twins by the fire, Mason sat at the table with the final wooden doll, James Collins, the last name on his list. The anniversary of the young soldier's death was still weeks away, but Mason felt the need to complete his ritual before they left, to bury the final doll, the final debt, and see if absolution would follow. You're thinking about him, Hannah said, not looking up from her task. The last one. Mason nodded, turning the doll in his hands. 17 years old, barely old enough to shave. He set the doll down carefully. I wonder sometimes what he might have become if he'd lived. Hannah wrapped Grace in a towel, passing her to Eleanor before lifting Faith from the basin. You can't know that, Mason. No one can. No, he agreed, but I can imagine. A farmer, maybe, a father, a grandfather someday. He traced the doll's simple face with one finger. All those possibilities gone in an instant. Hannah brought Faith to him, the baby wrapped snugly in a towel, her dark eyes blinking sleepily. And all these possibilities just beginning, she said softly, placing Faith in his arms. Because of you. Mason cradled the infant, marveling as always at how perfectly she fit against his chest, how naturally her tiny hand wrapped around his finger when he offered it. I don't know if it balances the scales. Hannah continued, watching them. Life doesn't work that way, I think. But maybe it doesn't need to. She touched his cheek gently. Maybe it's enough to acknowledge the debt and then live the best life you can in honor of those who can't. Mason looked up at her, struck by the wisdom in her words. When did you get so wise, Hannah Whitaker? A sad smile touched her lips. When you've lost everything once you learn what matters. What to hold on to and what to let go. Later that night, after Hannah and the twins were asleep, Mason sat alone by the fire. The wooden doll lay in his palm, its weight familiar after so many years. 17 souls, 17 lives ended by his hand, and 3 lives saved by the same hands. Did it balance? No, as Hannah had said, life didn't work that way. The dead remained dead. The guilt remained real. But perhaps there was another way to honor those 17 men, not just with wooden effigies and solitary rituals, but with a life well lived, a life that created rather than destroyed. Mason rose and moved to the trunk at the foot of the bed, the one he had prepared for Hannah's journey. From it, he withdrew a small wooden box inlaid with mother of pearl, a relic from his life before the war. Inside, 16 smaller wooden dolls lay nestled in velvet, each one marked with a name and date. Carefully, Mason added the 17th doll, James Collins, April 12th, 1863, to the collection. Then he closed the box and returned it to the trunk. He wouldn't bury the final doll. Instead, he would carry all 17 with him to Chicago. Not as a burden, but as a reminder, a testimony to the cost of war, to the value of life, to the possibility of redemption, not through forgiveness, but through service to the living. The decision brought a peace Maiden hadn't expected. Not absolution, he didn't believe in that anymore, but acceptance of his past, his guilt, his humanity, and perhaps most difficult of all, acceptance of the future that now lay before him. A future with Hannah, with faith and grace. A future he hadn't dared to imagine until now. The next morning, Mason rose early as usual, but instead of stoking the fire first, he stepped outside onto the porch. The air was crisp with early spring snow melting in patches to reveal the first tentative green beneath. Birds called from the pines, their songs heralding the changing season. Hannah joined him a few minutes later, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders against the chill. "What are you thinking?" she asked, standing close enough that their arms touched. "That I have never seen Chicago," Mason replied. "Never thought I would." Hannah smiled. "It's noisy, crowded, nothing like this." She gestured to the wilderness stretching before them. "You might hate it." "I might," he agreed, "but I'll have you three to help me navigate it." They stood in companionable silence, watching the sun rise over the Wyoming landscape. Mason had called this place home for a decade, had known every tree, every rock, every shift in the weather. Leaving it would be like leaving a part of himself behind. But what awaited him then in Chicago was a chance he'd never thought to have. A family, a purpose beyond survival and penance, a life. "Mason," Hannah said suddenly, turning to face him, "before we go, I need to ask you something." He looked down at her, this woman who had somehow broken through walls he'd thought impenetrable. "Anything." Hannah took a deep breath. "I won't go to Chicago as Hannah Whitaker," she said. "That name, that life is over." Her eyes met his, steady and certain. "I'd like to go as Hannah Sullivan, if you're willing." Mason stared at her, sure he'd misheard. "Hannah, I'm not asking out of convenience or propriety," she continued quickly. "I'm asking because in these past months, you've shown me what a good man truly is. Not through grand gestures or pretty words, but through steady presence, through keeping the fire burning on the coldest nights." Her voice softened. "Through seeing value in two baby girls when the rest of the world saw only burden." Mason couldn't speak, overwhelmed by her words, by the offer they contained. "I don't expect love," Hannah added, misreading his silence. "Not yet, maybe not ever. But I do believe we could build something good together, Mason. Something honest." Finally, Mason found his voice. "Hannah," he said, taking her hands in his, "I would be honored to call you my wife, to call Faith and Grace my daughters." He swallowed hard. "But you should know I already love you, all three of you, more than I thought possible." Tears filled Hannah's eyes, but she was smiling. "Even a man as quiet as you can surprise me sometimes, Mason Sullivan." 3 days later, they were married in Redemption Creek's small church. Reverend Williams officiated. Dr. Garrett stood as witness, and Eleanor Fletcher held the twins who slept through the entire ceremony. The vows were simple, the promises few but sincere. To protect, to provide, to remain faithful. To build a life together from the ashes of what had been lost. When it was done, when Hannah Whitaker became Hannah Sullivan, Mason felt a shifting inside himself, as if the pieces of his broken life were finally starting to realign into something whole. They left for Chicago the following day, the trunk containing their few possessions, including the box of 17 wooden dolls secured in the back of the wagon Garrett had arranged. The journey would be long, the future uncertain, but they would face it together. As the trail curved away from the cabin, Mason looked back one last time. Smoke still rose from the chimney. Eleanor had promised to keep the fire burning until the new owners arrived next month. The windows reflected the morning sun, making the small structure seem to glow against the backdrop of pines. For 10 years, that cabin had been Mason's sanctuary and his prison, the place where he'd hidden from the world and from himself. The place where he'd carved 17 wooden dolls and buried 16 one by one in a ritual of remembrance and penance. And the place where, against all odds, he'd found Hannah Faith and Grace. Where he'd found, if not redemption, then at least the courage to keep living, to keep trying, to believe that even the most burdened soul might still do good in the world. "Ready?" Hannah asked, sensing his thoughts as she so often did. Mason turned from the cabin to the road ahead, where Faith and Grace slept peacefully in their mother's arms. His family, his future. "Yes," he said simply. "I'm ready." As they continued down the trail, the Wyoming wilderness gradually giving way to settlements and then to towns, Mason felt the weight he'd carried for so long begin to shift. Not disappear, it would never disappear completely, but transform. From burden to ballast, from punishment to purpose. 17 wooden dolls traveled with them to Chicago, carefully preserved in their velvet-lined box. But so did 3 living souls, 3 beating hearts that Mason had once held in his blood-stained hands and vowed to protect. And in that balance between remembering the dead and serving the living, between acknowledging the past and embracing the future, Mason Sullivan finally found what he'd been seeking all along. Not absolution, not forgiveness, but peace.